The university is no longer just in crisis, it's actively collapsing. Schole IRL is a podcast dedicated to understanding the worlds people are building in its ruins already today. Each week, we explore the emerging experimental sphere of para-academia, with thinkers and builders doing the work to create spaces for communal study and knowledge-making alongside and outside the conventional university ecosystem. I'm your host, Sarah Begovac.
And I'm your co-host, Ira Allen. Together, we're learning each week how to salvage Schole from institutional hoarding and collapse alike.
Join us in reclaiming time and space for something like leisurely thinking outside instrumental ends. Schole in real life. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Schole IRL. This week, we are joined with Erin Manning and Brian Massumi from the 3Ecologies project, an autonomous learning environment exploring collective techniques for creative thought and practice. Its activities are radically open, guided by an ethos of self-organization and open accessibility. It affirms the value of neurodiversity and non-normative modes of thinking, being, and perceiving. The 3Ecologies project resists the neoliberal debt economy currently transforming the university into a colony of the job market. An essential part of its mission is to experiment with the invention of new alter-economic platforms that might offer it, and kindred projects for collective autonomy, the long-term possibility of becoming self-sustaining. Its activities and experimental techniques are developed and diffused without the intention of monetary gain for its members. In the immediate term, in order to obtain financial support toward the achievement of its goals, the following means are employed: applying for government grants, receiving and administering gifts, bequests, and other like contributions in cash, securities, or real estate, organizing fundraising campaigns for charitable purposes. As an alternative or supplement to the university, the 3Ecologies project does not grant credit or degrees, nor does it offer teaching services. It regards participation in collective thought and practice as rewards in themselves. Its aim is not to transmit already packaged knowledge, but to explore new modes of knowledge production that push the limits of how we know. The 3Ecologies project is a nonprofit organization officially registered in Quebec, Canada. The Montreal group serves as a coordinating node for a self-organizing federation of local groups active in North America, Europe, Australia, and Brazil. Erin Manning studies at the interstices of philosophy, aesthetics, and politics, concerned always about alter-pedagogical and alter-economic practices. Pedagogical experiments are central to her work, some of which occur at Concordia University in Montreal, where she is a research chair in speculative pragmatism, art and pedagogy, in the Faculty of Fine Arts. Recent monographs include The Minor Gesture, For Pragmatics of the Useless, and Out of the Clear. Her artwork is textile-based and relationally oriented, often participatory. She is interested in the detail of material complexity and what reveals itself to perception sideways, and the quality of a textural engagement with life. Her work often plays synesthetically with touch, of recent an acknowledgement and experimentation with the pro-tactile movement for deaf-blind culture and language. Tactile propositions include large-scale hangings produced with a diversity of tools, including tufting, hooking, knotting, and weaving. 3E is the main direction her current research takes, which is an exploration of transversality of the 3Ecologies: the social, the environmental, and the conceptual. An iteration of 3E is a land-based project north of Montreal where living and learning is experimented. Legacies of Sense Lab infuse the project, particularly the question of how collectivity is crafted in a more than human encounter with worlds in the making. Brian Massumi is a contemporary political theorist of communication, critical and cultural studies, philosophy, political theory, science, and aesthetics. One of the foremost thinkers of radical empiricism, he is responsible for enabling the widespread use of Deleuzian philosophy in communication and inaugurating the so-called affective turn in the theoretical humanities. Massumi is a retired professor of communication at the Université de Montréal and a collaborator of 3Ecologies, founded by Erin Manning. His most well-known translation is Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. He is the author of many influential books, including Parables for the Virtual, Movement, Affect, Sensation, First and Last Emperors, 99 Theses on the Reevaluation of Value, and most recently, Toward a Theory of Fascism for Anti-Fascist Life, a Process Vocabulary. Let's get it started here with 3Ecologies. Hi, Erin and Brian. Thank you so much for joining us today on Schole IRL. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. Can you tell us a little bit about what is 3Ecologies? How did 3Ecologies come into being? And what conditions are making it both possible and necessary?
It's a really big question, and so I'll try to be quick about it. I guess the first thing to make clear is that Brian and I are not people who plan things really clearly and then something happens. 3E emerged out of a 20-year-long project called SenseLab. SenseLab was originally created by me, but Brian joined very, very early. And SenseLab had as its central concern how to create an event. And we define the event as more than the sum of its parts. And the advantage of the long time span of SenseLab was that we could move in that slow motion way that can be really, really generative and learn what it is that felt most necessary. In those 20 years, we only did a call once. So everything was bouche à oreille. What is that in English?
What is it? Well, hearsay, just
anyway, people just came because they heard about it.
Yeah.
And most people who came early on stayed. And by about halfway through that period, two things happened. One of them was that we realized that it was wonderful to bring people to Montreal. We didn't have money, but we put things together. We worked with local grocery stores. We squatted other people's spaces. We slept on each other's couches. But when people came from all over the world, they went home without the conditions to continue the work, whereas we in Montreal had benefited so much from the events. And so by 4 or 5 years in, we started turning our attention toward helping people create the conditions wherever they were, while still gathering punctually, but not always in Montreal. So sometimes we would gather in Brazil or in Australia or in Europe. And so offshoots grew. There was absolutely no interest or concern about knowing what these offshoots were. And I'll just give you one example that I often give that makes this really clear. I think it was about 2013 or 14, and the public teachers in Chicago contacted me, and they wanted to know about SenseLab and about the practices and how to connect, maybe join an event. And I said to them, well, I don't think that you need us. We need to learn what you're doing. We know some folks in Boston who've been doing social justice work for decades who could be really interesting for what you're doing. They're in the African American community. They have the experience we think you might learn from. How about we put you together with them, and we could see if we could do some fundraising and send you some money. So that generally was how we worked. But by 2012, we knew we needed to leave the university. And I'm saying that, sorry, it's a bit long-winded, but I'm saying that because the kinds of folks that we learn really well with are definitely not primarily academics. There are some academics, but our environment has always been at least 50% non-academic. And so I had already by 2012 opened up my classrooms to anybody who was interested in learning, was working with a lot of people on Zoom. But we felt that we needed to move toward the 3Ecologies, which at that time we called Institute. So I'll let Brian continue from here, but just to say that when morphed into what it is now, which is the 3Ecologies project, it took on a form we could never have imagined in 2012. For really practical reasons, we thought someday we would have enough money to buy a building in Montreal and then house it there. We never had enough money to do that. The prices went up. And it ended up being possible to buy a piece of land, and suddenly the project grew around that problematic.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that we didn't start in the university. We started on the edges of the university and meeting in spaces, artistic spaces, or other kinds of community spaces around Montreal. And we were trying to create a kind of supplement to the kinds of inquiry that can happen in the university, but that get siloed into disciplines and deadened by the kinds of demands that are put on people's time, the way they work, and the form that the product of knowledge is supposed to take. So when Erin said that the idea was an event, the challenge was, what would it take to make academic gatherings actual events again, rather than simply forums for self-presentation and career path development. And we quickly realized that what it meant is that there had to be a kind of synergy between people where they enter together into an interaction from the angle of what's really moving them and inspiring them. And they leave their sense of status, their identities, their accumulated histories, to the extent that they shore them up as a personality in an academic world, and they enter with their skills and their passions, but without that baggage. And then if an event happens, you know it immediately because there's a sense of exhilaration that something is happening that you didn't expect. Ideas are percolating, usually too many ideas actually to follow through on. So there's always a surplus and excess created that allows you then to go back to it and continue. And then something happens that you can't reduce to what to individual people or what even that group of people were when they came in. So that's when Erin said that we didn't know what 3E was going to become. It's because we were still operating in that spirit that it had to be something that was emergent and self-organizing. And not knowing where it was going doesn't mean that we had no place to start. Where we always had very, very intense questions and problems that we were looking at, that we wanted to propose. It's a propositional structure. We propose problems, we propose problematics, and we move people together into the problematics to find ways of interacting around them across modes of practice, across art, across philosophy, dance, and then see what can come of the mix that is sort of crystallized by serious philosophical inquiry. So really close reading of philosophical texts is always a key part of what we do.
But and so just at a very, very concrete level, with 3E, am I right in understanding that part of how this plays out is in interweaving a set of land relations and a set of textual relations in a way that makes this maybe different from, because when you talk about events beyond obviously your own scholarship on events, part of what I hear is the hippie happenings, and you've got a farm and you've gone back to the land, and it could easily sound like as a certain kind of thing, but one thing that tended not to have as much, and that I hear in the way that you're talking about it, is this really, really novel set of interweavings between land relations and textual relations. And I'm saying textual really broadly. Is that something you could say more about what that looks like concretely in a moment of practice?
Well, first, the difference, I think, with happenings and with a lot of other practices that are more sort of avant-garde-ish is that what we do is not anything goes. What we do is very carefully conditioned. We set in place the parameters of those problematics, and we create what we call platforms for relation that seed interactions in very concrete, pragmatic ways. So even in relation to reading a text, we have techniques for how to read a text collectively so that people aren't just spouting opinions, but they're really delving into the text together in a way that they couldn't couldn't separately. So the
Well, I can continue from there. I'm allergic to that, going back to the land thing. I just should put it out there really clearly. I grew up in and around a commune. I know it intimately. It's exactly not what I want. So we talk about this work in terms of minor sociality, and I think that's really important what you're asking, Ira. Just to make this clear, we don't think it's a back to the land project. We
Yeah.
think you're always in the land. The city is the land. The institution is the land. There is no land separate. We know this, but we forget it, right? And
Mm.
but what we noticed is that in the city, if we go to the three ecologies, so the social, the environmental, and the conceptual, we tended us, not that people necessarily do that, we tended toward the social and the conceptual, and that's simply because it's easier in the city to do that. Impossible up here. We're far north. It's easily, colder than -30. We're completely off grid. It's extremely hard in terms of the technical knowledge that you need to have, and also the physical work that needs to go into, for example, having 40 cords of wood ready every year for the houses. It's a project that includes space, a cabin that people can come to for free. So it's an alter economic project in that sense, that is also pragmatic. If you come to the cabin, you're gonna have to learn some shit, like how to manage in this climate, how to keep yourself warm, how to to get the snow off solar panels, and when to do that, and so on and so forth. So we think of it as minor sociality. This is a concept around neurodiversity, where the social is simply not reducible to the human. In neurotypicality, there's a real premise on frontality, so human to human contact created or ritualized around certain activities, which tend to be presupposed. This is not what we're interested in. So if you came up here, we wouldn't necessarily have dinner together. We might. It might happen that we were chopping wood and we felt like cooking together, but it isn't premised on that. Its attention is turned to the problematic, and that's what Brian was trying to say, that the conditions are honed and not the relationships. The relationships are sort of secondary to the conditions, which sounds harsh, but we've learned over the years that if you want to do this work, and you want to get away from the idea that we're already in common, something we're both very concerned about, if you're really interested in difference without separability, as Glissant would say, it's not about being on the same page. That's not the point. The point is that you have work to do, and that you can learn from other ways in which the work gets done. And so what we've learned is to become incredibly sensitive and curious about how this work gets done. So if somebody comes to the cabin, we learn from them. Just like if we're having a conversation with you, we learn from you. We're not interested in telling you what we think, though we may do that. We're interested in pulling the thought into a relational web so that it can then mobilize itself differently. So the last point I would make is just a very concrete example. So I have deafblind folks. We have deafblind folks at the other house right now. This is a community that is called Protactile. It's a new language. Protactile, it's a touch-based deafblind language. And we were just talking, I was just there with them talking about how we learn here. And they were saying it would be so much better for deafblind people here than in traditional institutions, because a traditional institution has already delimited what it thinks is worth thinking about. And so, but if you watched it from the outside, you might say, well, these folks didn't do anything. They just cooked some meals together. They slept a lot. They went snowshoeing. They had a few conversations. But that's the work.
That's studied. Yeah. I think one thing we understood while we were doing Sense Lab, when we started thinking about relational dynamics that weren't reducible to the parts, we started noticing the contributions of the environment in the sense of the surrounds. So the non-human surround, things as sometimes as simple as temperature or light qualities from outside, but especially the architectural arrays and the way the rooms are formatted. We started doing a lot of experimentation on how modulating those factors created sometimes barely imperceptible but significant shifts in the tone of the interaction, how the interaction came. So we started seeing part of what we're doing as setting up environmental conditions conducive to emergent interactions and emergent sociality. So it was kind of a natural move from there to go to thinking of the environment in the usual sense of the forest, and asking what shifts when that environment with its very rigid, sometimes harsh constraints, what does that do to the interactions? How can you create, bring people in from outside with their own work and see how it's inflected here, and in turn how they're doing their work here being inflected by the environment here contributes to our project and our understanding of it. And I think why it's not back to the land is that we don't see the land as separated, because being here we can see how completely run through with movements that are translocal, that come from the city, that come from the sky, that come, that come from all different kinds of movements, crisscrossing through the land, and intersecting and creating little nodes of relationship. And some of them are ancient, like the tectonics of the earth, which is shifting in slow time. Some are super fast, like the internet signals we get through, unfortunately, our Starlink. And so we can have this vision of the land as a relational knot that's always translocal, whether you're in the city or not. And then when you start thinking in those relational terms, you can start being able to move back and forth some of the things that you understand and can work in from the city to the countryside and vice versa.
I think that's super important, thinking about all the relational dynamics that take place in these moments. Can you share a couple more moments where this idea of emergent collectivity can enable conditions for communal learning and thinking together?
Yeah, a really good example of that is when we make the maple syrup. So, for those people who are not familiar with the process, the maple trees, so sugar maples, are the sap in the sugar maple during the winter months is up in the branches and works as a kind of antifreeze. And then in the summertime, it goes into the roots to support the root culture of the trees. But in a very short period of about 6 weeks in the spring, when the days are above zero and the nights are below zero, the sap moves up and down the tree. And in that period, you can tap it. And this is an ancient indigenous practice that has been taken up in the eastern United States, and then this part of Canada and Quebec and Ontario. And so each year you tap, those people making maple syrup, each year you tap the trees. We have around 850 taps, a quite complex system. And then you boil down the sap, and the sap gets boiled down about 40 times. So it's a big process, and we do it the ancient way, which is to say with wood. And so in the period of the mapling, you could think of it as the perfect school ground. Right? I mean, we don't talk about it that way, but you're doing biology, chemistry, meteorology, art, philosophy. But what you learn very quickly is that the stakes, and this is very important to us, I think we say this a lot, the stakes are really clear. We think of the work we do as speculative pragmatism, and another way of talking about it is how and what else. The how of pragmatism is really, really important to us. So, the trees are only going to give sap under very specific conditions. You can't wish it to happen. Believe me, you want to sometimes, but you can't, right? So, and then it's also completely surprising. Like the meteorological conditions seem like perfect, but you're not getting sap. And because there isn't enough sun, but the temperature's right, but it's just a little bit too humid or whatever. And or your fire, which was going so well until 2 p.m., for some reason, the fires around 5 p.m. are always really, really hard. There's an atmospheric shift around that time that dulls the fire. And in order to make maple syrup, you have to go 7 degrees Fahrenheit above boiling, which is quite difficult. And so you have to become extremely attuned to the fire. Every time you open your door to add more logs, you lose temperature. So you're in this environment of both extremely slow work, because you're going to easily wait 6 or 7 hours until you get to the place, like daily, until the place you could make syrup. Sometimes 12, sometimes 15, sometimes 4. You can't say for sure, but there's a long period. But then once the sap reaches the level of syrup, it's super fast and very stressful, and there's a lot to do. And so here we are in the sugar shack with collaborators, many of whom are neurodiverse in our context, and there's a lot to pay attention to in more than one register. An emergent sociality grows there every time, because the stakes are high, because we need it to be, but also relationally. So I give you a very concrete example. We had 2 collaborators. We love working with them. They're both autistic. And one of them, we give ourselves jobs, and they're important. And one of them, the job was to keep the level in the back pan even, because the thing you're most afraid of is burning the pans. You burn the pans, you scrap the system. It's easily $15,000, and you don't want to do that, and it's really easy to do. And at a certain point, this person was getting really stressed because it's very hard work. But when we said to this person, well, do you want someone else to take over? That wasn't what they wanted. But they wanted another kind of support, but you don't have time in that context to be like, let's have a discussion about another kind of support. So you have an emergent sociality, really, in the sense that Fred and Stefano talk about it in the undercommons. The emergent sociality is like, say I take 2 steps to the right in order to be on the lookout of that particular piece of equipment. Brian is just intuitively taking 2 steps to the place where I was, because the conditions are such that it needs to happen. So when people ask me to come to 3E, people write me all the time. I always suggest that their first visit be around the mapling, because they'll learn what we're trying to do without having to read philosophy, without having to talk about it. They'll learn something in their bodies. And, that doesn't have to be the way, but it is often the way for us, that we prioritize practice as a kind of starting point, and then grow the thinking through the practice, which I think is probably my most intuitive way also, because I'm an artist and a mover. I tend to work out of practice into, but I don't want to create a dichotomy between thought and practice, because I don't think there is one.
So we move people together into a complex situation where something's happening. And then there's a kind of choreography between what's happening and in the conditions and what's happening among us. And we sort of dance together and with the conditions to move through the situation and to create something. In this case, it's something quite concrete, maple syrup. Usually it's not that concrete. I can give another example of an event we had this fall called Giving the Land Back to Itself. And that's a concept that we want to create. We want to experiment with ways of taking land out of the property market, out of private property, so that putting it into a status where it formally has no capitalist value, and remake our relationships to the land so that we, speaking collectively as 3E, no longer own the land, but that the land doesn't belong to us, but we belong to the land, and we're in a role of custodianship over it. So, but having something that's not property, that's not owned, but has a legal status, but has a culture that's way beyond what the legal status sets in place, that's a conundrum. It's a problem. What it could mean just conceptually, philosophically, to give the land back to itself is a big issue. So that's the problem we came together around. We brought people together, and we selected certain texts that we thought would crystallize some of those issues. And then we invite people to stay with those texts, but also to, when the Spirit took them, to propose activities. So there's no agenda other than the texts. There's what we call prop-up propositions, and we have ways of people proposing them online and on a very large sheet of paper, where anyone who wants to propose an activity that comes to their mind through the questions and through the interactions thus far can propose something. And if it's alluring enough, people come. There's no central direction. There could be 3 propositions at the same time and then just see what happens. And then propositions normally then build on each other throughout the event, which could last from 3 to 7 days. And there's a kind of momentum that builds where the thinking from the text starts passing through these very often hands-on activities, indoors or outdoors. Some of them are movement-based. There are many different kinds. Some are additional readings, some are more sort of artistic-based, some are artisanal. And then we try to just create a kind of well, at one point, one talk, we called it a relational soup that starts to simmer. And again, it usually creates more momentum and more ideas than can actually be followed through in that event. So there's always this extra that can move into another event. So a lot of the practices we talk about is how do we move that extra from one event to another? So we have a concept that we call the Anarchive, which is the archiving of traces of events that can become the seeds of new events.
Can you say a little bit more about that Anarchive, about the ways in which this very particular collection of processes of evental negotiation together makes something that moves beyond the moment?
Well, we started working on the concept. We're very slow, as I said before. So we started working on the concept around 2012, and it came from a realization that we were completely uninterested and very bad at documentation. That we like to be present in the event. There's no central maneuvering body ever at Sense Lab or 3E. We don't hold meetings. We don't discuss what we're going to do. The activities grow, and they grow or they don't grow. You could make a proposition and nobody shows up, then it doesn't happen. And you need to learn to be okay with that. What we say to people is, it's got to be something you want to do. And if you want to do it, you'll do it. And if people show up, great. If people don't show up, like, go to someone else's proposition, try to not think of it as something you are giving, because it's not that, right? It really is a proposition. Alfred North Whitehead has this beautiful idea of how you make yourself a proposition. It's a field effect, a proposition. It's a collective sociality, let's put it that way. So what we realized is that we weren't excited by the idea of documentation, because that takes you out. Like, documentation has the flavor of separating you from a process in order to, give an account of it to someone else. We know this. It's become so much part of our lives with social media. But we felt, as I mentioned before we started recording, we felt incredibly curious about other people's processes and thought what the world needs is what we started to call a process seed bank. Like, we really need each other's processes. And so in a way, we were maybe being selfish by not finding ways to share them, and maybe calling on others to share them back. So we developed the idea of the Anarchive based on that, thinking, well, there must be seeds of process that have a certain kind of rhythms or certain kinds of potency or certain kinds of quality of life that we might be able to give an account of or produce conditions for. And over years and years of experimentation, we became better at recognizing how they were working. So I know this sounds really abstract, but it isn't actually. It's the laughter in a dinner meeting, in a dinner that you're having with friends. It's the excitement of an idea that moves you in a curious direction in a conversation. It's the memory of joy joy of an event. Like it's the affective force that populates all of our.
It's a capture of that.
It's a momentary capture of that, but that's fleeting in a sense.
That feeds forward.
That feeds forward.
I mean, it can take many different forms. One archiving event we made was around the question of the book, and we wanted to say it was open the book in the sense of opening a book to new forms and asking what it can also be. That question of what else, the speculative side of speculative pragmatism. So we had about 30, 40 people who came together, and we just made books together. In that sort of artistic, philosophical milieu, the books that were made were pushing the boundaries of what a book could do. So it was actually what else can a book be, and it took concrete material form. So that question was materialized. So we had books, for example, that were very complicated contraptions, strings, very cleverly designed. So it could only be read with 4 people working together. We had another book
Rube Goldberg books.
Exactly.
We had another book that could only be read by putting it down, unfolding it down a flight of stairs. So these are questions. How do books relate to the architectural milieu? How can books relate to more than one person at the same time? So it's imbuing more questions and more potentials into the book form. So then that book, if you give it to someone, or even give the idea of it to someone, that carries with it those questions, and it incites them to experiment. And then the event can be repeated. So it can take many, many forms. Sometimes it takes forms like that you could think of as being artistic. Other times it takes the form of what we call techniques. So, for example, for reading together, we created this technique that we call conceptual speed dating, that I won't go into, but it's a particular kind of collective reading process. And so we described that technique, and then people take it up. Groups in Italy were using it a couple of years ago, and obviously they didn't have the same experience we have. They don't have the same background, maybe not the same philosophical bases, so they do it differently, and it becomes invented. So it's disseminatory. It moves outward, seeds somewhere else, and becomes something new. It's become something emergent again. We've been working for a long time on a digital Anarchive that we have a prototype for now, which during events, allows people to put traces of images, words, and sounds into this very creatively designed platform. And it doesn't have a tree. It's not hierarchically organized. It's rhizomatically organized with sort of tunnels, like quantum tunnels that go from one page to another. That you can add them yourself. You can create more and more connections. You can anything you put in can be modified by someone else. It turns into these shifting collective compositions made with the traces of what happened or what came up through the event. And then because it has to do with a self-organizing process that's relational, the system itself has a certain agency where certain parts of it will age and then become traces of themselves. If there's too much on a certain page, it tips over some of the content into another page. Sometimes it'll steal something from one composition and take it somewhere else. There's a compost heap where things that decay go into, and then they turn into particles that reconglomerate into forms that they're going to be taken back out. So it's like this ecosystem of traces of what happened conceptually and perceptually at the events. That is just trying to leave a trace of some complexity of interaction that had a quality that people felt was different from everyday interactions.
And that's in the digital Anarchive as a trace that is also a seed. If we're
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So, I mean, one of our main questions has been, given the conditions of planetary devastation, we've really cut down on travel. And so a lot of the work happens on mediums that are less than ideal, because they're so frontal, because they don't allow for lurking. which is a really important part of collective work. And so we've tried to design, collectively. I haven't been part of the design, but I'm part of the conceptualizing of the design, platforms that allow for that kind of lurking. And it's extremely difficult because the web is the internet is based on a hierarchical model that opens through a password that is self-presenting through that mode, and we become very, very trained to seek quick content on the internet, and to see it as a tool rather than a practice. So these have been really big questions for us. But ethically speaking, I mean, I think this is something I would just like to add. I think of anarchiving as an everyday practice in all situations. So, we're working with people here from the village. Whenever we work with people from the village, we pay them. The payment is part of one economy. It archives itself in one way. But paying someone to do a job also almost always carries an excess of enthusiasm, of curiosity, of suggestion. Somebody is helping us renovate the cabin right now. I'm not interested in telling him what to do. I trust that he has that kind of knowledge that we then are in conversation with. A creativity grows and brews between the two of us that can't be reduced to the $30 an hour I pay him. But the $30 an hour I pay him is the pragmatic constraint of the relation, which is also really, really important and should never be overlooked in the way that we think. But we never think that $30 an hour carries all the measure of our encounter. We hope it doesn't. We try to create conditions so it won't, and so there's always this question in the way we work about what are the conditions we're setting in place, and how else are they shifting the contours of the event as it's creating itself.
And one of the things that we're always thinking about is how we enter into relation together, how we move into a situation of interaction together, because so many things are determined by that movement over the threshold. And if it's done in a way that reduces the relation to a transactional interaction, or if it simply activates your sort of official status and capacities, for example, someone well-known moving into a conference context, then that sets in place certain dynamics that it's impossible to overcome after that. So we always try to think, how can we create the conditions as people arrive that signals to them that we're not asking them to self-present and self-advance, but to move into an interaction on another basis. So we always try to, just like those books that had something extra, asking a different question, we try to put conditions in place for asking, as we move in together, the question of what else could this interaction be. For the digital anarchive, if we had individual logins and the usual kind of surveillance apparatus and security apparatus around that, that's a certain kind of signaling. That's signaling that we are your judges. We are the ones who are giving you permission to do this, and you are there on condition that we think your behavior fits our norms of behavior. So instead of having that kind of individual login, we have a token, which is collective. So everyone in 3E has a token. And all they have to do is put the token in to get into the anarchive, and then they're in a 3E space. And so the entry is collective, and it moving into a collective space. And I think that changes tremendously how people are interacting with the digital space.
Absolutely. I think thinking about the signaling conditions and these relations that we form for thinking and learning are super important to think through. Can you talk to us a little bit more about some of the projects or practices or collaborations that 3E is involved in that feel like they produce new or alternative conditions, even more so than what we're talking about, for thinking, learning, or relating that last like the Anarchive, but and perhaps in other ways are outside of traditional academic forms? And then also how important is being off-grid for this work if others take inspiration from 3E?
Yeah. Well, throughout the history, one thing that was, I think, like one of the ways we set conditions in place was always to have moving between art practice or philosophy and social engagement. So starting already from a certain point of intersection. In 3E, we have, because it's in the forest, there's a lot of projects around land regeneration and gardening, where we're trying to sort of nativize, sort of adapt to northern conditions and very, very particular microclimates, principles in ecological gardening, agroforestry, permaculture. So there's sort of an ongoing experimentation in that. Sometimes there will be building propositions, like a couple of people decided that since we had a pond, we would have to have a sauna so we could jump in the pond after having the sauna. So a little group just got together to figure out how to build a sauna and built a sauna. So I don't know if that answers the question very well, but
Well, I think the main thing is that we've honed a practice. We have different ways of naming it, but it's a propositional practice that is really born of the potential for things to bring a difference into the environment. So I'll come to the sauna example. So, the sauna comes from a place of enthusiasm, right? A couple of people think we need a sauna. Generally speaking, our response is always yes, right? Sure, let's build a sauna. What would it cost? How would we do it? Who's in? Who wants to do this? And Brian and I aren't even really sauna people, so we don't tend to use it. But we've learned that building something is really great. It's really fun. You learn, we built a really nice thing, and now we're a bit more confident about building other things. And the sauna then becomes its own conduit to other forms of sociality. So there are some people who come up here who use it all the time, and then they prepare really nice saunas for other people who are here. Another example of that is we built a kiln. So some folks from Montreal, because our work has always been completely open. There's no way in and there's no way out. You wanna come, you come, you collaborate, you collaborate more, you collaborate more. It's really that simple. The people contact me all the time about coming, and I don't even like Google them. I just say yes, I write letters all the time to help them get funds. And if they show up, I know they're already ready to be there because it takes some effort to have arrived this far. And because we don't prioritize self-presentation in any way, those folks who would want to be self-centering don't even get interested. So it doesn't even happen, But so people from Montreal, they like from the university in the ceramics department, they say, hey, Erin, I've got a group of students and they'd be interested in getting local clay and maybe building a kiln. And I'm thinking, amazing. I've always wanted to make pottery, right? So I then become a student of that environment. I contact my neighbors here saying, does anybody have clay? The next thing you know, we're in someone's basement, getting clay out of their basement. The next thing you know, they've made a piece of pottery for that person. New relationships are being woven. And then they, we've got this kiln. And then I get an email like a few months ago from one of the people saying, hey, Erin, I'm so sorry we didn't show up for a year. And I was totally surprised. Like, that's not an issue for me. Like, it's not about building an institution. We built it. We made some stuff. It's great. And if you want to come back, we'll make more stuff. And if the kiln ends up degrading because of the temperature, it's okay. We'll build something else. So it really is about the punctuality of the encounter and the belief in a very strong sense of what it fosters and learning in that momentum. But like we said before, it isn't anything goes. So, you're going to hear me be a lot more bossy around my garden, right? You want to play with me in the garden, then you're going to do it on my terms, right? So like, this isn't,
you can always start your own garden.
Or start your own garden, right? So it isn't like there's a lot of dictatorship in this. It's a kind of anarcho-communism, so it isn't like touchy-feely, though we do hug a lot, it's more like I'll be working in the garden. The garden's really my baby, and people will say, do you want me to come? And I'm like, no, I really want to be alone, but I'll be moving manure later on today if you want to come and move manure with me, I think the most important thing is that we get really excited with inflections. And when the inflections happen, we follow them, right? And so we become the students of the processes by following them.
And I think it's really important not to underestimate the importance of the reading groups that happen through 3E Online. That's often the first point of landing for people into the project. There are 4 reading groups that are going on, none of which none of which we run at the moment. And again, it's propositional. Members of the network will propose, and then it comes together. And it's a way of people starting to explore the kinds of issues around process, around relation, around environment together. And that's a kind of gateway into moving into other activities. Some people never do. Some are content with the reading group. A lot of people do move through the reading groups into visits or sometimes organizing things where they are. And it's important because it's a kind of intensifier. A good reading group around a complex text can really intensify people's curiosity and the potential paths of answers and movement out of those questions for them. So they tend to gather around issues like what constitutes process, what's the relationship between process and product, what's the contribution of the more than human in relational milieus. There's a lot of, and then people see that what 3 is trying to do is to move those questionings into embodied interactions, not to replace the reading and the conceptual work, but as a complement to it, a reciprocal to it that goes back and forth. And I think that's been that always having that conceptual experimentation side to what we're doing that's also collective and self-organizing rather than pre-decided or imposed as a framework. I think that's been really, really essential to what we've done.
And just a quick thing to add that it has become the practice, this grew organically, that the reading groups, all of them at the moment, I think, you read the work out loud together. So we're very, very slow readers. It would, take us easily a year to get through a text, and the focus is really on staying on the page. So a weekly reading group or a bi-monthly or whatever, you would maybe maximally read 10 pages at a time. So it's very intense collective work. And so you don't need a background. And this is a part that's really, really important because, we can have people as young as 12, 13, 14, and people as old as 80 in a reading group. The people have vast differences in terms of how they come into an encounter, and there's absolutely no place for proving how smart you are because you're just staying with the text.
Yeah, there's no propounding, there's no sounding off. There's simply interrogating the text, looking very closely at it, at what that particular turn of phrase does, how the text is made, how the concepts move through that texture. So there's always attention on the text rather than on the person, on the people. And people can meet in that attention on the text because it's around a very particular passage or a very particular set of words. It disables all of the kinds of self-performance that can happen through a reading group that activates differences in a preparation of background knowledge, because life knowledge can be as important for understanding what's going on at that level as university learning.
That actually really maps nicely with our next question, which is about Schole. So as you know, I mean, our exigence for this podcast is sort of trying to understand what it looks like to salvage something like Schole, something like conditions for a leisured or slow engagement with texts broadly conceived on behalf of collective self-fashioning or self-fashioning for the collective good. Or and I'm curious how how you all understand Schole or scholarship or being a scholar, although not necessarily a self-presenter as scholar, relative to the work of 3E. What does it mean as the organization continues to seed new worlds beyond itself? What does it mean to hold space for Schole there, or to map possible growth patterns for Schole in other places?
Well, probably neither of us have ever foregrounded the concept of being a scholar, because we both of us sort of fell into academics because we needed a place to think and to think together, and we thought that thinking itself was really part of what the world needed, and that it is, in a way, concrete. It's not something that's separate from everyday life, but it can very easily feed into it and augment it. So, well, I mean, I think we thought of ourselves as sort of being intensely and passionately involved in the problematics of the world around us, and that there was always a speculative or conceptual side to those that have to be taken into account along with the pragmatic side. But the term, and we'd never worked with the term Schole, but that understanding of it in terms of leisure, which I actually hadn't understood was the etymology of it, I think puts a new cast on it. It makes it something that we could work with, because it sort of gestures to concepts of study, as in Moten and Harney, where there's serious but informal learning interaction going in the everyday world, and that when we move into more formal interactions around knowledge formation, that we need to be very careful to stay in a continuity with that, and to be able to see it in and out of it.
Mm,
I was having a conversation before I came here with the first two people who will get PhDs who are deafblind, and they're both in the other house right now. So Celine just finished her PhD, and John Lee Clark is doing a PhD. Um, John is somebody that, the listeners might want to look into. John Lee Clark has written two books at Norton, How to Communicate and Touch the Future. And so John is a real leader. I mean, they're both amazing, but John is a real leader in the deafblind community. And when John decided he's a friend, and when John decided to do a PhD, it was very pragmatic. I said to him, I'm going to still be in the university for a little bit for financial reasons. I need to stay a bit longer. I think we could get you in, and it would open up grant possibilities and other possibilities, right? So this is an account that we could hear in first generation people, indigenous people, deafblind people, in neurodiversity. It's you have the people who are at the beginning of being granted that status.
mm,
And they're often very pragmatic. And I love that pragmatism, right? So today we were having this conversation, and Soline, who just finished her PhD, I'm just blocking her last name, so I can't remember it, but was saying that it was really, really stressful because in her defense, one of the committee members refused to to be engaged in protactile. So he refused to be touched. And this was so violent because, of course, it's the only way she can feel the world, right? And
mm,
that, as a deafblind person in the institution, you're always running up with a normative idea of what a scholar is, and you have to twist yourself into that normative frame.
mm,
And then John was saying, I don't feel I have to do that at all. And that's because over 20 years at Concordia, to the dismay of some of my colleagues, we've really worked to craft environments that don't fit into those normative standards, right? So we were talking about the difference between the two, and we were talking about scholarship. But then John said, Erin, what do we do about the fact that the majority of deafblind people don't have access to learning protactile, right? And this is a very pragmatic problem. Deafblind people are not, there's a small population that is very distributed, and they're very, very underemployed, and it's which means that they're poor, which means that they don't have access to travel, which means, and so on and so forth.
mm,
And so we were having this conversation about, like, at what point the conceptual work becomes important, like if you don't even have language to communicate. And I think that what I love to do is to have conversations that don't hold those in a binary, right? So that we can have, on the one hand, a conversation about like real down to earth practices. Well, I'm writing a grant right now in order to try to get money so that I can funnel it into communities so that more people can learn protactile. I can't write the grant saying that because that won't get funded. So in order to do that, I use the scholarship that I'm built through and in, and that I also love to do, in order to come up with a project, in order to hire people who are deafblind, in order to manage that. And at the same time, we're having conceptual conversations about capture, about politics, and that's turning into a conversation about the desperate situation in the United States right now around deaf and deafblind services that have been completely cut by Trump and the administration and so on. So I think what I'm saying and what Brian was saying is that for us, they're always moving through. We try never to stop one kind of conversation in order to have the other conversation. And we trust that in the other conversation, whatever it's about, the conceptual is bubbling in ways that new forms and forces of life or new modes of existence are being generated. And so that our work then is, or my work is, to become attuned to them, to become sensitive enough to be awakened to them wherever they happen. And so, this very conversation is an example of that, right? So I go on Facebook, however awful that environment is, and I read a post by Ira. I love what he says, so I go and become his friend. And then I read more posts and I think I got something to learn from this person. And the next thing you know, he figures out he has something to learn from me and we're in conversation, right? And and in that whole process, we didn't have a conversation about how we're important or how we're smart or how what we think. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That if you and my experience has been, and our experience has been, that if you simply bypass that other way, which you can really do, really bypass the self-presentational way, you're so enriched by the everyday that you never have to find to claim a difference between hierarchicalized and non-hierarchicalized modes of learning.
There's a lot of what Erin was saying around the deafblind community sort of explains why we don't like the idea of the common or even of community, because it assumes a common starting point, a kind of sameness that we depart from, and our differences are sort of a deviation from it. But our differences are constitutive. They're really part and parcel of a mode of life that's different from one to another. So deaf-blind people and sighted hearing people, um, they don't really have a common world, right? They intersect, they inhabit the same contexts, and they intersect with them, but from different angles to different effect, to different qualities. And that difference is the richness of it. So we think in terms of intersecting modes of existence, intersecting worlds, rather than a common world. And we want to open things up to more of those differences. So we're more interested in how we can be different together than how we can come together to be the same. So, and that's across the board. That's one of what's the reason that we're so inviting of neurodiversity and attentive to neurodiversity. Because the same thing could be said for autists. The same thing could be said around gender lines and around transgender. The same thing could be said around indigeneity and ethnicity. That what's important is the way that there are contexts that we all move through and inhabit, but that we all do it from our different angles and vectors, and yet we intersect and we can create something at that intersection. But that's not making us the same. That's not reducing us to a common denominator. And too often ideas of the common, the universal community do that.
Absolutely. And the deepening attunements to those intersecting worlds and imagining what learning spaces or sites of possibility for learning can look like. How do you imagine the future of learning spaces like the one you've made with SenseLab and 3Ecologies beyond the universities? And are there other spaces you take inspiration from or hold as cautionary tales?
Well, I went onto your website and was really excited to listen to other propositions and other ways. One of the things that we've been very careful about and uneasy about is the tendency in the cultures we come from, that I come from, to elevate longevity over process. So when I started Sense Lab, it became a kind of running joke because I kept trying to end it. Because, I didn't want it to just persist. Projects have personalities and they have momentums, and they also have lifespans. And our experience with Sense Lab is that there seemed to be a punctual 4-year lifespan. That after 4 years, something needed
Mm.
to switch. You actually needed to end it, or something new needed to come in. And that had something to do with the way that, if, in that context, a 4-year period generated a certain kind of growing commonality. And after a certain while, the common began to take over. And that's a very
Mm.
comfortable place to be, because suddenly you're recognizing your tendencies in others. But it's a dangerous place to be because it becomes easily an exclusive space where suddenly you don't
Mm.
want difference to enter because you've
Mm.
got a common language, or you've got a common set of practices. My sort of intense physical intuition in that moment is to kill it. And so I did try several times, but every time I tried, someone else would start it again. And that's the beauty of, processes that are emergent. And so what I really hope is to never become worried about longevity. Now, that's a complicated thing to say, though, with 3E, where we're trying to take land out of the property market for perpetuity. So it is a project in perpetuity, and we are thinking about future all the time. Right? So when we're thinking about custodianship, when we're thinking about writing a brief in terms of what it means to give land back to itself, we are thinking about our deaths. And we're thinking about it in really pragmatic ways, like
Mm.
how can we, purchase a house close by so that we can eventually have a custodian who takes care of the process. So the pragmatic concerns of 3E are different from Sense Lab, and are forcing us to face this question a little bit differently. So I
Mm.
guess all I would say at this point is that what I do feel like the university is a dead end. I also feel like the university does something super well. It attracts really great people, and it grows a certain kind of quality of encounter under certain conditions. It facilitates immigration in a lot of cases. It offers potential financial opportunities under some conditions through grants or through, projects. So it has some infrastructure. Some good libraries can exist. It gathers people who themselves have good infrastructures, including the sharing of knowledge and books and so on. So it does some things really well, but systemically, it is a neoliberal site of capture. Like that's what it is. Do we want them? Of course we want them. We need them, right? Do we want to understand them as the sole place where learning happens? No, absolutely not. Learning happens almost by mistake in those environments, right? So how do you hold all those things together? And one of the things that we've been very careful about is to not assume there's like some magic space elsewhere, right? There
Mm.
isn't. Right? So we're always going to fall prey to re-enlivening those tendencies, both good and bad. And every time we think we know what we're doing, we're in danger, I think, of growing something that could become putrid. So the best thing I think we could do, or I can do, is keep being excited by what other people are doing and learn from them what they're doing, and also embolden them in every way that I can. By this, I mean as much financially as conceptually, to do the work that they need to do.
Yeah, and I think projects that we think of as having a kind of kinship with what we're trying to do, uh, are percolating everywhere. We've been working on a concept of the para-institutional, and that's the idea that you can sort of move to the edge of an institution and a little bit beyond into a margin beyond it, where the institutional logic doesn't constrain you to a certain set of preset norms. But you don't have to give up all of the resources of the institution. You can keep one foot in and one foot out. You can contribute to it by contributing sort of provocations for it to change and to maybe live up more to to its mission. For example, the learning mission of the university, which seems to have come on hard times. Um, and so at the same time, you're creating relation that moves across a border, that's opening up spaces beyond the border that could grow into more autonomous spaces. So you operate on that borderland. And that's happening all the time. People in the university create research groups or reading groups that attempt to do things differently and attempt to have a foot in the community or a certain set of stakeholders. Um, there's in the art world, there are artist-run centers and various forms of collectives that spin off that are never completely without a relationship to the official art world, but can never be reduced to it. So being in relation but irreducible to is a para-institutional imperative. Um, in social justice circles, there are projects that don't see themselves as having answers and serving a set of constituents, but see themselves as moving into a relational milieu and helping spark things that might already be underway and creating emergent forms of problem solving for that community. Often, the project that we've been most in touch with, called the Design Studio for Social Intervention in Boston, tries to create a design or a sort of aesthetic element into social justice work. Then there are in the area of sort of agriculture and food production, there are different kinds of cooperatives that have formed again attempt to create a different economy around food and different procedures for growing it that are environmentally consonant. In the political area, there are federative projects like what we see but don't hear enough about or know enough about in Rojava in northern Syria. Basically, anarchist federative organizations that try to return power to horizontal networks, ground level, has also happened among the Zapatistas. So we see inspirations everywhere. We don't ever think that we're alone or a leader or have the model. We see ourselves as contributing in this percolating of activity that's always happening.
That's actually a great transition to our next question. Who are some thinkers or scholars, older or contemporary or both, who you think our listeners should be reading right now and why, related to maybe para-institutional, para-academic work or beyond? And how does your own collaborative work in 3Ecologies relate to and grow out of your own scholarship or experiences of Schole in communities across time?
Well, I definitely think people should be reading John Lee Clark, who I mentioned before. And we've been Brian and I have run several book series over the years, and I could really recommend all of those books. But another voice that I think is really important is Adam Wolfond, whose book The Ways of Water is simply exquisite. Adam is the first non-speaking autistic to get a university degree in Canada. But there are so many. I think when Brian was speaking before, I was thinking that the concept we're not saying out loud, but we're talking about is immanent critique. Both of us are very suspicious of the ease of critique in the normative sense. Very, very easy to just say you could think something better than someone else. Whereas immanent critique is Bertrand Russell says, having hypothetical sympathy for the process of thought. And as a result of my interest in immanent critique, I'm a very slow reader. So I tend to not read very widely, reread a lot, and learn from little bits and pieces of thought and think that through with others. And I work across so many kinds of environments. The folks up here that I collaborate with, many have not finished high school. I don't think of them as not being able to teach me. I just don't speak to them in the same way. I learn from them about fixing cars and building houses and but also ethical questions come up between us. So for me, the process philosophical literature that grows my ethical baseline has been really, really important. I think Alfred North Whitehead has been really, really important, but I've also been very immersed in Black thought and have felt like the ontogenetic side of Black studies is so process philosophical. And I'm thinking here of Nam Chandler, I'm thinking of Du Bois, I'm thinking of Fred Moten and Stefan Harney and Saidiya Hartman and Tina Kempt, and I could go on and on and on. The thinkers who have embrace the idea of an aesthetics of Black sociality and the para-ontological, and have really helped me think about whiteness, and have helped me really understand neurotypicality as a systemic baseline rather than as a person. And then there's just the ongoing political work that we're always trying to learn from, like trying to decipher what's happening in Rojava, trying to feel into these, that what I mean bits and pieces is sometimes you just don't get the information fully formed. I don't know, what would you add to that?
Well, I think we've been sustained a lot, as Erin said, by the Black radical tradition. There's also places where there's a lot of ferment and creativity happening, include indigenous thought. I can name Dawi Kopinawa, who is a Yanomami shaman who wrote a book about the metaphysics of the Yanomami. Viveros de Castro, who's written about Amerindian metaphysics and the relation to the more than human. There's in another place where I think a lot of interesting thought is bubbling up is in relation to trans experience and transgender. Personally, we all go sort of keep returning to certain references in process philosophy. And process philosophy is basically the philosophy of the event, the philosophy of change underway, of things in the making rather than things made. And so we don't leave the dead white thinkers behind, because there's a kind of dissident, very creative tradition, and a lot of things that can be taken from it. So we read Whitehead. Often reading groups include Whitehead. We keep going back to Gilles Deleuze. The whole concept of the three ecologies came from his collaborator Felix Guattari. We go back to William James, and who at the beginning of psychology created pathways to a different psychology that didn't become the psychology we know, but is filled with potentials. We go back to very strange thinkers like Charles Sanders Peirce, who is the creator of semiotics and a logician of relation. So we have a lot of reference that sustain us philosophically, and then there are these
Edouard Glissant is a big one.
Edouard Glissant, in terms of the Creole conditions and concepts of the world that are textured and relational. So we have those more classic readings, but then there are certain areas where there seems to be a lot of ferment of thought going on right now that attract us.
Yeah.
So, just as we're kind of closing our conversation for today, I wanted to ask you, what have we not asked you about that if we were better attuned to your processes, we might have? What else matters to
I
you?
don't think there's anything that you haven't asked.
How not to wear yourself down.
How to have stronger shoulders so all this physical labor doesn't kill your shoulders.
The friction and wear is a big question. How to have the energy to keep going. That question poses itself in the university and in many other areas in terms of burnout. So there have to be forms of, I don't say self-care, but mutual collective care to take care of, to address those issues. Here we have the issues that are very physical, of physical wear on our bodies, because we're out shoveling meters of snow every winter and moving tons of tons of wood every year, as our
Yeah,
so that kind of, I guess you could say sustainability, but that's not a word you like.
I hate sustainability. Talk about like thinking as low as you can. Imagine being excited about the sustainable.
I do want to sustain my shoulder.
But I think what I would say is that one of the things I think about a lot is this idea of being always in the possibility of learning. And I work, as I said, a lot around neurodiversity, and I am neurodiverse in ways that make living difficult. So this is the harder conversation, right? The conversation about how hard it is to live in this world and how many of us really struggle. And a lot of our work is about addressing activation issues right there. Like literally how you get out of bed. How do you motor a thought through a pathway that can be given value in the system that we live in? Right? So some of us do well in this world, and Brian and I are lucky in that way because we can do that with language. We can take language and motor it down a path that has legibility. But that's a skill. It shouldn't be given the moral value that it is. Right? A lot of the people that I work with, it's not their way. Language is not their way. And yet we continue to place value on language operating in that way. All of our academic institutions perform these extraordinary normopathic takedowns of people who don't participate in the right way, which is to say they don't activate their being in the environment in a way that makes it legible that they're learning. So those are really big concerns that I have, and they're connected to the problem of accreditation, and maybe that would be a place to end, right? So when we're talking about alternative ways of learning, we should be, I think, suspicious of accreditation. But it's very easy for a white middle-class person to be suspicious of accreditation because I come from a place where I'm already going to be taken seriously as a thinker. Less so maybe than a white male, but more so than most people. Also because I come with a sort of confidence of an educated family. My grandmother was one of the first people to get an MA in women, sorry, to get an MA in Ontario. So I come from a place that assumed I would be able to think. A lot of the people that I work with don't come from that place. And the pathways of learning that they engage, the systems of accreditation destroy them. And yet, we all know that they carry value, these pathways. If you don't operate on those pathways, you already have to have the prestige value in another way. Right? So this is a knot that we're not going to be able to solve easily. And I think we have to be, I want to be in the learning of how to be in strategic duplicity with that knot. So when, for example, I do a PhD with John, it's because the PhD will actually open some doors in that community. More so than, say, with our son, who we discouraged a little bit from doing a PhD.
A little bit, a lot.
A little bit, a lot from doing a PhD. Saying, Jesse, you've already got, the status of an intelligent person in the world. So why don't you do something else and keep learning, right? You don't need to go through the university to do this because university is a dead end for you as a white male. It's going to be really hard, to excel in areas that you're interested in the university, because we're at a point where we need those environments to be more cross-pollinated by other kinds of bodies, for example, and other modes of existence. So and then there's the question of age, which I think about as well. How do we create conditions for learning that continues into modalities of life that have been radically undervalued, like dementia? And because that too is neurodiversity. And how do we think about that? So I'm always thinking, when I'm thinking of learning, I'm thinking across all of that. And I'm trying to think about how to retain an open enough body that I don't get afraid in the face of these modalities, like dementia, for example, or how do I generate excitement for the possibility that you make your money separate from your excitement about writing books, for example. Like how do we help grow that kind of public intellectual separated from the notion of accreditation? So those are really complex knots for me.
And also, how not to despair. Our approach in our philosophy is affirmative in the sense that it wants to move into the complexities of what's there and be a kind of collaborator for the emergent tendencies and the movements of creativity through it. But it doesn't mean accepting the world as it is, because accepting the world as it is would be accepting horrendous power structures that are becoming more and more extreme by the day in our period now. So looking at what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in relation to South America and US relations now, climate change, the move toward fascism, authoritarian regimes that's happening a bit throughout the world. It's really hard sometimes not to despair and to hold on to that kind of affirmative approach in the everyday and toward the work that moves through the everyday. So I don't know. I don't have any answers to that other than to say that by moving together into collaborative, alternate form modes of relating and learning creates a certain intensity that gives momentum to everyday life, and that gives a sense of it having been worth each day having been worth living, and that sort of cocoons you in a little sort of a circle of intensity and affirmation that maybe can counter some of the sort of disturbing trends coming from the outside. It's hard not to despair because objectively the prospect for the world is not good.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I mean, I everything I do with the horizon of staggered collapse. I will say, listening to you two tell the stories of the work that you do is an incredibly empowering for me. So thank you so much for making time for us. This is really, really, truly wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having
I
us.
hope we continue this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Erin and Brian.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
And a huge thank you once again to Erin and Brian for joining us this week. The theme of emergence really resonated with us after our conversation, and how we can attune to conditions that enable a sense of emergence in modes of thinking, being, and perceiving. As Brian said, to the kinds of inquiry that can happen in university, but that get siloed into disciplines and deadlines by the kind of demands that are put on people's time, the way they work, and the form that the product of knowledge is supposed to take, and how we can allow people to move into an interaction on another basis, one that allows for a new emergence for how we can think and relate differently together, that enables new modes of knowledge production that push the limits of how we know. Some of the ideas that stood out are the process seed bank, how we can share each other's processes, not just the final product or the accredited results, but the rhythms and qualities of how we think and live together. The Anarchive, the idea of archiving past events that can be seeds for what comes next, and the prop up propositions, where there is no agenda and new ideas or ways of being can emerge in a moment. I think it's important to be attuned to this idea of emergence and to be open to practices, ideas, or ways of relating that invite us not to self present or self advance, but to move into interaction on another basis, into a sense of Schole in real life. And tune in next week where we are joined with Tuba Shekic. Shala Diner, and Muhammad Mustafa Alapsi from Off University, a self-organization of scholars at risk who seek new strategies to sustain academic life and knowledge threatened by anti-democratic and authoritarian regimes. With the rise in political oppression and threats to intellectual freedom, we talk about how the work happening at Off University provides a safe, intellectual, online community for endangered scholars and students. We talk about learning and unlearning of what constitutes scholarly life when its very conditions are under threat. Until then, for myself and Ira, thank you for listening.
Watching as the vortex spins below, you throw an insult to the volcano. Oh, my lord, is nothing sacred anymore. No.
Thank you to Devin Church for making music available from his album All That's Solid Melts into Air. For a link to Devin Church's music and other key resources on today's episode, check out our show notes.